So what I wrote here is ready stories, and I think it just says ready stories because I quickly copied the slides from a workshop that is kind of like a broader take on um, what comes before you have stories. So all the conversations that lead up to the stories. So this would be the subset of slides that's about the ready story part. And I'll give credit to Lisa, who's in the meeting in this talk today, because I think she's the first person that I heard the phrase from, distilling conversations into ready stories. We do a agile methods meetup, and we were generating topics for the group to talk about, and distilling conversations into ready stories was one that
But I think Ryan Quinn actually said the words.
okay, it's good. For some reason it matters to me to, yeah, because I was like, ooh, that's so good. That's a very
Yeah,
descriptive.
it was definitely someone else who said it. I just wrote it down.
Okay, yeah, awesome. All right, perfect. All right, nice. Um, okay, so, oops. All right. So I made this slide for another reason, but I thought it was kind of interesting. I'm not going to read all of it, but there's I think some core competencies that are behind this, all the topics that we're going to talk about. Um, the idea of a ready story is, what stories are we telling about our users and what we're hoping to make it possible for them to be able to do, what behaviors are we trying to make possible or make realistic. And there's an approach we're going to cover, that I think if we're doing it in the way that we're going to cover it, it encourages true accountability on the team and amongst the people who are going to do the work. It really hinges on competencies of agility and inclusion and resiliency and self-awareness to work in the way that the following slides will explain. And getting our stories ready, going from conversation to user stories and to real into making things real, takes courage for various ways. And there's leading others. It takes leadership to work this way, leadership on the parts of everyone on the team, and communication and business acumen. It's all these things are all rolled into and underlying a lot of this talk's content. Okay, so this is an overview of sorry, I'm getting distracted by Slack on my actually give me just a second here. Hold on. I need to quit that. Hopefully that'll stop that. So sorry for this. I'm sharing my screen to my iPad, and I had Slack on my iPad, and Slack was just totally blowing up on my iPad because I closed it on my computer, so it just made it worse on my iPad, which is where I had the presentation shared from. Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to reshare that. Okay. Looks like it's not going to stop on my iPad. This is good. I've got other talks today, so I'll figure it out by those other talks. But all right. So if the topic that we're working on across our time together is distilling conversations into ready stories, this is kind of a I feel like this is kind of a yucky overview. I like this slide because I borrowed this from another coach that had it in a deck for a workshop we were doing. Um, but it gives you kind of this detailed way that you can look at, like, so you can see the business here at the table in the top left having conversations, and they're envisioning a product. And really, this is the part where the product owner in an agile process is spending half of their time with the stakeholders, keeping alignment, prioritizing the parts of the desired product, and bringing those pieces and that alignment and that strategy to the dev team and having conversations with the dev team. So it's been all conversations up to this point, conversations with the business, the stakeholders, and conversations with the team. And there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of details that happen in there. And that work gets worked on, and you review it, and you learn from it, and you build it, and you have more conversations, and you learn and you work, and at the end you have your final desired. Yes, somebody's commenting there are no users in this slide. That, yeah, where's the customer in this slide? Yeah, right. So I guess we could put the customer. We would try to get the customer in a number of places, but yeah, that's. So the point of this slide is just to say that, well, first, one thing I like to say about this slide is I think it's ironic that the final and desired product looks exactly like the envisioned product, which is actually not really ever the case. But really, we're talking about the conversations that are happening in the terms of getting this work done. And so it's really happening in the conversations between. We're going to talk a little bit about the conversations heading into the team, and the conversations on the team is really where we're going to focus. So the user story comes from extreme programming, and it's called a user story because of what we do with the story, not for anything specific about it. And we tell stories for a shared understanding. So this is a drawing from Jeff Patton, where the more traditional way is somebody comes up with all the requirements, hands off all the requirements to the team, and the team reads the requirements and says, okay, we get it. This is what we're going to build. And that's kind of that slide up on the top left. But if you had a conversation as represented by, let's get our ideas out in front of each other, we might find out that we all don't quite understand it the same way. And we need to have conversations with each other to build a shared understanding so that we all agree and that we're all working toward the actual same goal. So that's really what's really important about having conversations with people and focusing on the stories that we're telling when we're trying to get something done, trying to explain what we want to get done, and converse with the people who are going to get that thing done. This is an overview of how I want to get to a ready story. I love this image. I'm not sure who created it. It's floating around on the internet. It's a popular one. So if we start with our goals, really our ideas, what we're trying to improve, what we're trying to get accomplished, we can have conversations about those things. What are we trying to do? We're basically telling each other our big stories, and we have more conversations, and we can think about breaking those things down into achievable pieces, and we split up those stories. And then really what happens between that kind of initial stuff where we're talking and we get down to the point where this is something that can get done, it's ready to be done with the team. So that's a little bit of how conversations, I think, fit in, and telling each other stories on the left. And on the right, it's kind of breaking that down more to go from the why and the outcomes that we're going to down to the specifications, and ideally becoming code. And so you can see the goals and the impacts have a little box around them. We're going to touch on impact mapping. That's a technique to a structure to ideate within. And then story mapping breaks things down further. And you get your biggest stories out of story mapping. We're going to look at how that lines up. And then once you have your user stories, those are the things, if you've worked on an Agile team, that you may be pushing across the board from to do to done. And we're going to look at how you break those down into specification by example. And so we'll be looking at getting them ready and what our definition of ready might be before the team commits to getting them done in a reliable way. So for impact mapping, let's say that we've done the work with our stakeholders. Maybe they have some business analyst expertise, and they've figured out what they're trying to do. And so in this example, we've got, we need to do multi-factor authentication. We'd like to do it to achieve multi-factor authentication. We have this hypothesis as to the benefit, and we have a sense of, what we're trying to, what the acceptance criteria might be. So something like this, we can think about this in an impact map. So this is an example of an impact map. So an impact map starts with the why and branches out to the who and branches out to the how and branches out to the what. So the way you think about it is, why are we here? What are we trying to achieve? So for example, our goal could be enhance user security via both password and device. So we want to enhance user security. And so then the next question is, once you have a goal, the next question is, who are all the people or personas that could have an impact on this goal? And so you ideate through, and you might think, customer, salesperson, system, they could all have an impact on enhancing user security. And then for each one of those, you ask, so you can imagine doing this in a room on a whiteboard with stakeholders, multiple people. Of course, you get the right people in the room. And so you ask, how is the customer going to have an impact on this goal? And you come up with ideas. And then for each one of those ideas, you ask, what do they need to be able to do this how and have an impact on the goal? So you can see across, we just did an example across the top. So you end up with a lot of what's, and the what's kind of end up being the things that get built. And the cool thing about an impact map is it really solves the problem of the idea of ideas that don't drive toward a goal. So if somebody really liked the idea of integrating with, AOL Instant Messenger chat, hey, we should integrate with that chat. Well, the question is, where does that fit on this impact map? And it doesn't. So maybe there's another idea that fits with, but that's not really something that we're going to work on in terms of achieving this goal. And how this relates to user stories is, if we take this image from Gojko Adzik, he's got a book called Impact Mapping. It's very, very easy to read, and it's a good read. It's a very small book. So you define the business goal, you name the key personas, and you describe desired change in behavior, and you find what features that allow the desired change. And so this picture is, the biggest one of probably, you'll end up with your biggest user stories, which are called epics. So as a player, I want automated invites so that I can invite friends. Right. And we know that that's going to drive toward the goal here in this picture of getting, up to 1 million players. Back a slide. As a customer, I need USB tokens as a first layer so that I can authenticate via multi-factor authentication. And if we started with impact mapping, we know that that story, when it makes its way through to development and is broken down into smaller pieces, it's going to tie all the way back up to one of those original goals and conversations that the whole organization has been having. So that gets us from our goals to what, how we're going to impact those goals. And we've gotten basically a set of deliverables. If we, draw out the impact map and see how they turn into our biggest user stories, we essentially have our epics that we can use a technique called story mapping to have more conversations about. So just to be clear, with the impact mapping, you can imagine it's maybe on a whiteboard, maybe on using a tool like Miro for if you're all online, but you're having a lot of conversations about what you're trying to do, what your goals are, what your ideas are. And then story mapping is another tool which you can all do together to have more conversations about what you're all trying to do. So story mapping is a really cool technique. Jeff Patton is credited with this. I wrote a book on it. And so really the idea is that if you have this idea where a version of this idea requires, in this slide, feature A, B, C, and D for it to be a whole idea, you can see that across as an end-to-end workflow. And then within each of those columns, you can have different features. And so if you prioritize the features within their feature set, then you can work iteratively across your end-to-end workflow. And so in this example, A1, if you accomplished, if you broke your big idea down into smaller user stories for A1, B1, and D1 through 3, that could be your first iteration. And your second iteration could be some lower priority versions of A1 and C, and you can work through iteratively in that manner. And it's considered an iteration because it has a little bit of every feature set. So it's kind of a heavy slide, but there's a really popular game that we do in workshops called the morning game, where you think of all the things that you do in a morning. So you can imagine people grouped into small teams of 5, and they think of every single task that they do in the morning. So A1 could be make coffee, A2 could be make lunch, A3 could be have a bagel, and the feature A column could be nourishment. And then another feature column could be, getting ready, where some things are like shower, brush teeth, get dressed. And so we organize them into a story map, and then we say, okay, well, when you normally have an hour, now you only have 15 minutes. So in the exercise, we've organized all the things that you do to get ready to get to work on time in the morning. We've organized them into the columns, and we've prioritized them into inside of each column. So then it's pretty easy to say, okay, well, I'm just going to do this stuff and not this other stuff, and I'm going to have a version of my morning and get out the door safely on time. So you can really see how thinking iteratively and strategizing in iterations, you can almost always achieve some version of the goal given an unpredictable timeline and unpredictability in the complexity of what you're trying to do. So that's story mapping. So we've done, we looked at impact mapping quickly, and we got our biggest stories out of that. And then we broke those biggest stories down across a story map. And those are going to give us the smaller pieces that we can work to do. And it also helps us think in an iterative strategy on which ones we might do or we'll try to achieve first, in which it'll help us kind of sequence things a little bit. So now we've got the rough pieces, we've got the big ideas, we've got the conversations, we've got the whole idea of how it ties back up to a goal. And so we basically at this point have a goal and a strategy, and little cards broken down in our story map that we're at where we could consider the user story level. So Ron Jeffries is credited with the 3 C's for user stories. And the 3 C's for user stories are card, conversation, and confirmation. And so there's a saying about a user story is if it can't fit on an index card, then you need a smaller card. And so what that is talking about is how the point of it is not to get everything on the card. The card is supposed to just be a placeholder for a conversation. So it's just enough that it's going to remind whoever it is that is going to help build this shared understanding with more people, just something that will remind them about what they know about this thing, because that person is going to, it's best if they're the person that's been involved, they've got the shared understanding of how this card even got to be something that we're going to try to do. And you take that, and that person is typically the product owner, and you meet with the team during in Scrum, it would be something like a refinement meeting and then sprint planning, and you're having these conversations with the team. So you've got your card as a placeholder for the conversation that you're going to talk about with the team. This is what we're trying to do. You guys are the trusted experts. And then we want to hear back how you're going to do it, or you're going to figure out how to do it. And so what you need at this point is confirmation. And so that's where acceptance criteria comes into getting a story ready to be committed to. So you can see in this drawing, they're having this communication where the product owner is speaking in triangles and the dev team is thinking in squares, and it's much more complex than that. They have the conversation, and the confirmation step is the important part of getting this thing ready. So a little bit about user stories. This slide feels like it comes in a little late, but we saw this in impact mapping. And this is the traditional, kind of the most common format for a user story. As some persona or actor, I need to do something so that some benefit or goal is achieved. And so we can remember how this covers all the important pieces of achieving our goals and all getting on the same page and building a shared understanding. I think what's important to me about putting the user story in the context that we've put it in so far in this sequence of slides is it really helps with understanding the format and why the format's important, and also not everything is a user story. So a lot of times with teams, you'll see if you don't have all the context of what the purpose of a user story is, then you end up with a situation where a lot of people are just spending a lot of mental energy, a lot of extra time cramming simple tasks into user story format. But really, the format is supposed to be a mechanism to make sure that we're thinking of all the pieces, the critical pieces that we want to bring to the team to have a conversation, so that we touch on all the important points. So who is this for? And what do they need to be able to do, and why? And so that, right, you need the why, you need, you want, basically what you want with the shared understanding is you really want why we're all working together to travel all the way, to just be present in everything that we do. And so why that's important. I guess I'm deciding on if this feels like a tangent or not, but you need to have a shared goal. And so if you're trying to be agile, what you're really talking about is self-organization. And to be able to self-organize, you need a goal and equivalence amongst all the members on a team. And so the user story has this that's why the so that part is so important. And that's a part that gets left off all the time. A lot of times you'll see user stories that teams are working on, and it's just as this thing, I need this thing. As this thing, I need this thing. Just a list of these things. And basically the goal has been dropped off. If you don't have the goal present with all the members of everybody on the team and the team of teams, you're really hampering your self-organization and therefore your potential to even be agile at all. These ones actually don't line up to the impact mapping, which I think is okay if we're flexible about things. So what is missing from this user story format? Let's do some audience participation. What's missing?
How?
Yes, what we can call the acceptance criteria. Yes, exactly. So like a lot of times, as a product owner, you often think like, all right, well, here's my team. I trust my team on how they're going to do it. So here's what I want, and I trust you guys with how you're going to do it. So that's exactly what's missing, and we're going to talk about that as acceptance criteria. Oh, first I just want to go on another little tangent. I think it makes sense for anybody to be able to create user stories. So that's a question that comes up probably at this point. I don't know if anybody was wondering this. Who creates the user stories? And you can tell, like, I last used this slide in a corporate environment where people work in work cells, which is kind of interesting to read it after being out of that for a little while. So you really want your team to feel empowered, or to feel like they can have ideas and create user stories. So the product owner is accountable to what's in the backlog, and they need to be able to account for why something's in there and explain that and explain the thinking behind it. And it may be the case that some of the created user stories don't make sense to be in the backlog, but really anybody should be able to, if you've done a good job at creating a shared understanding and having your conversations, and you're really distilling that down and keeping the goals in mind, you can trust your team to get what you're all trying to do, and everybody's going to have a different perspective. And you're going to miss out on valuable perspectives if you make user story creation only one person's job. I've seen some really confusing situations where the Scrum Master was told that it was their job to write the user stories. And that's how I ended up creating the workshop that these slides come from. The Scrum Masters in an organization were really trying very hard to get some help. How do we write user stories? And it's like, why are you guys writing the user stories? Where's the product owner? And really what was happening in that situation was it was just a big handoff. It was, here, you guys are doing Agile. That means you do user stories. Here are all the requirements. So turn them into user stories. And so the ask was, hey, we've got all of these requirements and we know they need to be user stories for some reason. So how do we write better user stories? And so what we learned several slides back, that it's not about writing user stories, it's about telling user stories. The writing part comes later, and it's not even in the user story format when the writing comes. A good user story will will follow the invest criteria. So when you are writing the user story in its format, you'll want to make sure that your user story is independent from other stories. It doesn't depend on something for it to be able to be delivered. You'll want it to be negotiable, because the team might point something out, in your conversations about this user story. You need to be open to finding out that it needs to be changed a little bit. There's some insights from the team that are valuable. The user story needs to have value, and the so that part of the user story format is going to help you here. So as a person, I can do a thing so that I'm able to achieve something. If we've done a good job with our impact mapping and with breaking it down in our story mapping, then the so that part is really going to tie that to the value. And it needs to be estimatable. You need to be able to estimate it. Oh, sorry, ST. And small is good. So smaller stories are going to be easier to talk about. They're going to be easier to understand, and to know when they're done. They're going to be easier to test. They're going to move faster across the board. They're going to get done more quickly. So small is good. So you may have a story that has an and in it. As someone, I should be able to do this and that so that I can do this thing. You might want to split that into 2 stories and talk about them independently. It's going to be more clear. And testable. You want your user story to be testable. How are you going to know that it's done? And we're going to see in the acceptance criteria how to really drive that home a little bit. Does anybody have any questions so far? Is this, how are we doing? Okay. Cool. All right. Thank you. All right. So we've got our card, and it's written in a format so that we're going to that are going to trigger conversations around the critical pieces of what we're trying to get done. And we've done a good job to break it down and distill it to this point so that it ties up all the way up to the ultimate organizational goals. And we're ready for the conversation. And so if the product owner has been involved all the way up to this point, you can see how they're so critical, and basically how they earn their name, product owner. They're understanding the product, the goals of the product, how everything we're trying to do with it ties up to the ultimate impacts. And so they have all the context. But they're not focused on how it's going to get built. So they know what they're trying to achieve, and they have a sense of all the little whats that might do that. But you've also got this team of people who are working, that are making this thing true. We're making the whole product true, accomplishing all the different goals. So you have that conversation with the whole team. And you don't have to do it in any single event. In Scrum, which is probably the most popular place that user stories are used today, you can have real-time conversations daily in Slack as stories start to emerge. The product owner can be reaching in, and this is a tricky thing, because you don't want to start breaking that Scrum value of focus. You don't want to be breaking people's focus and jeopardizing their commitments. So it's a delicate balance. But a high-performing team will work together, respecting each other's focus and commitments, and having these conversations in real time in appropriate ways. But a very popular meeting, which is usually a few days before sprint planning, is called a refinement meeting. And that is where a lot of conversations can take place about the stuff that's getting to the top of the backlog. And you're really having those initial conversations and trying to surface what's confusing about these ideas that we're trying to get done. How can we make what can we do to make this more ready, to make this more closer to getting that confirmation? So if you remember the 3 C's of user stories: card, conversation, confirmation. We really want to get to that part where we're getting that confirmation, and that's gonna be the last few slides.
Lily,
So
can I, this is Lily.
I wanted
Can
to jump in too, but Lily, go first.
Okay. So I did development in the field of aging for a very long time. And that's why I brought up the whole point about where's the user in this. Because what I experienced was that developers and testers and even the product owners did not understand that older adults have palsy. So when they had to touch a button, we had to make sure that they could touch a button and not have to type. And some of this is accessibility issues, but it was really brought home to me at that time that the user, and knowing your user, and the best way to know them is to have them in the conversation, was significant in the how, how is this going to be done, but also the why, and that there was not a complete understanding always of that. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. Yep. No, I completely agree. And I'm hoping that that's not getting left out in any of these too much, in any of these slides. Sometimes I think, like, we do, Last Call does a lot of university websites, and I'm always trying to think of ways, like, to get on campus and to do surveys, and not like to do like real life conversations with the essentially the users. An interesting thing about the university website is a lot of times what our goals have to do with prospective students, and the prospective students are currently in high school. And so it's an extra kind of an extra trick to try to think about how to do that. But we do a lot of a lot of times, actually, that's cool. That brings up a cool point, because a lot of times in these initial conversations, even during like things like as soon as you're getting out of impact mapping, and maybe during like the story mapping area of the conversations, you can prototype some stuff. So people use tools like Envision. We're actually switching to Figma, or we've switched to Figma, to prototype out what it is that you're thinking you're going to build, and to do user testing on that, to get user feedback on that. And that's impacting the conversations before it even gets to this place where you're in sprint planning, having a conversation about what you're trying to do. But it becomes the context that you're bringing to it. Like, we know we want to do this because our users are experiencing it this one way, and we want to change things so they can experience it a different way. I know that Lisa was thinking about jumping in, and I saw that Rick raised his hand. So
okay,
Lisa.
so I'll be quick. It does build on what Lily said, but I one of the challenges that I've seen and been working on, how to deal with is helping developers get to the point where they're willing to say, I don't fully understand this story.
Yeah.
Because there's this enormous temptation to look at the story and say, oh yeah, I understand what these words mean. Let me just go start coding. And to get them to the point of looking at that card or Jira, whatever it is, and saying out loud, I do not understand what this means. Let's talk about it.
Takes a lot of courage. And I guess I usually come at that from like a Scrum master perspective, because those are the Scrum values. The Scrum values are commitment, focus, openness, respect, and courage. And so if you're just saying, hey, we get this, and you're ending up in a position where you need a lot of rework, or you can't finish it by the end of the sprint because it turned out you didn't really get it, you might have a retrospective. If you have a good scrum master, hopefully it'll come out in a retrospective that, hey, maybe we're not being courageous enough in our conversations. We're not having the courage to be open about the fact that the story doesn't make sense. So that's critical. Got the 5-minute warning. Let's see what else we've got. Well, and also, so like when you get to the confirmation part, I think that might help. It's probably one of the harder parts technically, I've found. But it is not hard to do the basic level of confirmation. So let me, so a spike story would be one that where the development team does have the courage to say, hey, we kind of don't get this. And this is where a negotiable story is important, where the product and a good product owner will say, hey, figure it out. Don't commit to something you don't understand. Let's make a spike story, and you can do some research and figure it out. All right, so I don't know why. Oh yeah, actually I do. All right, so the confirmation part. And Rick, did you raise your hand a while ago for something you want to throw out quick?
You finish first, then I'll go.
Okay, cool. And yeah, we do have a few minutes for questions after 11:45. We're okay. So the confirmation, we've got in the red box, we've got the user story format, and we've got the acceptance criteria in that space where something was missing before, where we noted that it's, well, how. The confirmation is where, like, I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation with somebody who's kind of got some skills in communicating, and they say, well, let me say back to you what I think I heard you say, right? So they put it in their words so that you both know that you're on the same page. I like to think of the confirmation that way, where you bring what you want as a product owner, you bring what you want done to the team, and you have a conversation. And the acceptance criteria is them saying back to you what they heard you say. And they're putting it in a format that makes sense to them. So it could be something like just a clearer paragraph. That's like the most basic. Here's what we hear you say. So for example, this acceptance criteria: show a list of pediatrician offices in my zip code, including their address, the names of the pediatricians at each location, and a point on the map. Those that are in network should stand out. So I doubt that the user story said any of this stuff, but when you brought the user story to the team as a product owner, you talked about all those things, and the team was able to say, well, hey, knowing whether it's in network or not, it's right there in the database, super easy. And if we could just, style this to make it stand out, and that would be super easy. We'll basically get that for free. So then in the conversation, it's like, yes, that sounds great. That's what we're going to do. And so the user story then represents that. The team came up with that. And so it's clear to everybody. You've got the shared understanding, and the issue is the story that they're pushing across the board from the do to done is understood by everybody and committed to, especially by the team, in a way that they will feel comfortable holding themselves accountable to it. A useful tool for good acceptance criteria is to make sure that it's SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time boxed. Over on the right, we've got an example of good acceptance criteria and poor acceptance criteria. So you can see that the good one is very clear and measurable and testable. The brand is a multi-select, the screen is certain sizes. Whereas in the poor acceptance criteria, it's not very specific. It's not measurable. It's just the system shall respond quickly. Well, how fast? How do we test that? So there's examples of 2 there. And so if you make it SMART, you open up the door to going from traditional testing to shifting the testing left. And the way that you shift the testing left is with behavioral driven development. So that's where you basically write the tests first and do the work until the tests pass. And that's what the next, the last few slides we'll look at pretty quickly, is writing in a Gherkin syntax, which makes your stories testable by verifying their behavior. And this is a form of what's called specification by example. So you're writing the tests first, an example of what you're trying to do, and you're working until that example is true. So you can see here on the left is simple English acceptance criteria, good, specific, testable acceptance criteria, totally fine. But if your team gets good, and even product owners can get pretty good at this, writing it in Gherkin syntax, which is over on the right, specification by example, given. So these two are the same acceptance criteria, and one of them is in Gherkin syntax. And if it's in Gherkin, it can be brought into automated testing. So you're writing your tests first. And so if the team has an automated testing system, that opens up the door to that. So just to wrap things up, we went from our goals and impacts with impact mapping to our deliverables, to our epics, to our user stories and story mapping. And we had the conversation and confirmation, and got our acceptance criteria out of it. That is possible to be written as specification by example, that can then become automated tests in code. Yeah, and Cucumber is an example of a tool that works with the Gherkin syntax. So what happens is you get code out that the customer is using that ties all the way back to the original goals, that if we've had our conversations well enough and we've included our users well enough, and we've had the courage to talk about them and have real conversations about them where we're trusting our team, all the people on our team are going to get code that really drives towards our goals. And so, how do you get to a ready story? I think, you get it so that you have that confirmation from the team that they can commit to it. And that is a story that's ready to be worked on. So here's a slide. People can take screenshots and some additional resources if people want to take a screenshot. All right, I'll leave this up. Questions?
You mentioned Figma. Does that allow you to do clickable, clicking around type tests with users?
Yes. Wasn't what's his name? Tom Urell?
He was going to give a talk, unfortunately he didn't. But as far as I know, we use Figma just for design. We don't use it for like clicking around testing. So I was wondering if that's possible with Figma.
I've seen the Figma links. I haven't had the opportunity yet to click on the Figma links. We just switched over to it.
You can make prototypes with Figma.
Yeah, I'm assuming you can, because we're ditching InVision for it. We've got like it replaces InVision, Sketch, and maybe one other thing that we're using.
You can see some examples on Andy Bell's site called Front End Challenges Club. The Front End Challenges Club, he puts out the challenge, and he uses Figma prototypes to explain how it's supposed to work.
Cool. Is anybody using user stories in their work?
We are not, but I would love to learn about it. Do you have like one or two of the best sources to learn about all this stuff?
Well, Ron Jeffries, he writes interesting blog posts, but I think if you scan some of his work, he's got some good stuff. And I think Mike Cohn, I don't find myself always agreeing with exactly how Mike Cohn lands on stuff, but he's got a lot of stuff. Yeah, he's Mountain Goat Software. And Jeff, actually, you should watch some stuff by Jeff Patton. He's got a lot of talks. He's probably one of the best understandings of a product owner in my opinion. So let's see. Oh, and we've got 10 minutes. The other presenter might be in here. So we've got something in the chat. Hey, Kelly, you talked about the situation with the Scrum Master and mentioned it wasn't about writing stories, but telling stories. Can you revisit that? Right. So if you focus on writing the story in the way that those Scrum Masters thought they had to do it, you're going to put in too many requirements, and you're going to take away that space from the team to innovate. The team is going to know things, and they're going to have ideas, and you need to make space for that. If you worry too much about writing in all the specifications, you're just extinguishing that potential. So I think one of the slides in here, it says the product owner may intentionally leave stuff out. So as a product owner, you really want to focus on the goals for your product and how that drives toward the goals of the organization. And that's what you're focused on. And you have this incredible team of amazing potential with ideas and expertise. And I think as a product owner, you want to experiment with leaving room for that, right? So you might have ideas of more specification and more ideas of how they might do it, but you don't want to start there. You want to have that conversation first and see what they come up with.
You were just saying in that situation that there was like too much emphasis on the story writing as the whole process, and they were missing a bunch of steps, and that writing the story is like shorthand. Should be a whole lot of other stuff that's already happened. Yeah,
the story writing happens with the team, right? So it could be like, let's have a conversation, and how are we going to put this into acceptance criteria? And so I think that's the part of the story writing that the Scrum Masters, in my experience, were being asked to do in advance. So in the corporate world, it's very common. Basically, they're trying to figure out what to do with all their people. And so they're like, all right, you're a product owner, and these other people are business analysts. So you guys pair up and figure it out. And it's just way too common for the product owner and the business analyst to write out they just write a bunch of requirements. And then the Scrum Masters are asked to convert those to user stories. But there's no conversation happening.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, the Jeff Patton talk, he has one about why documents fail, which really talks about shared understanding, and how so he uses this example of how he went to Hawaii, and how he has this picture of himself standing on a beach, and he's like, so to you guys that's just a person standing on the beach. To me, that represents this time that we went to Hawaii and all the beaches were super crowded, and we learned from a local about this beach that was never crowded, but we had to drive through the mountains to get there, and I hit a pothole, and I thought I damaged the rental car, but when we finally got there was all this beauty and all these, and he tells this whole story, and he's like, that's what that picture means to me, and I can see that picture, and I can tell you that story, and now when you see that picture, that's what that picture means to you. And that's what the user story on a card is meant to be. So it's just the signal for that understanding. And so as a product owner, you can think of yourself with all these pictures and all these stories, and you go and you meet with the team and you share that understanding, and you know that they've heard it because there's a conversation where you put acceptance criteria together to kind of match that up. Oh, lunch is next. Lunch break is next. Oh, so that means we're going to go into coffee and networking.